This is part 3 of our section on Judaism. Today we're going to talk about the history of the Jewish people and of the diaspora, the Middle Ages to modern day. Remember, the diaspora is the phenomena of the Jewish people having to be dispersed, scattered amongst a number of other nations because they couldn't return to Jerusalem or Israel. We're also going to talk about how that history led to the origin of a number of modern Jewish sects. And next week we're going to look at modern Judaism and practice. We're going to hear from some guest lecturers. But today we're going to talk about just a little bit more about how we got there, how we got to the place where we are now. So you'll remember our timeline. It goes all the way back to 1900 BCE, the life of Abraham, the first patriarch. It was not until around 1000 BCE that the kingdom of Israel was founded and was eventually divided into Judah and Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Babylonians in 722. 200 years later, or about 150 years later, the southern kingdom fell. The Israelites were no more. They became known as the Jews. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, forcing the Jews to come up with new ways of worshiping and following their traditions. The way they did that was forming the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew scriptures, and the Mishnah and Talmud, which are the commentaries on the scriptures, and these become central to Jewish worship, as we've talked about. The Crusaders massacred a good number of Jews during the Crusades around 1095 AD or CE. The Jews went through years of wandering through Europe and looking for places to stay, and we'll talk about that and what that did. The Enlightenment was represented a major change for the Jewish people. We'll talk about what the Enlightenment is and why it was important. And of course, the culmination of the diaspora was the Holocaust in World War II, which eventually led to the State of Israel. Today, when we talk about citizens of Israel, they're called Israeli, right? Citizens of the ancient Israel were Israelites. Citizens of the modern Israel are Israelis, and people who practice the religion of Judaism are Jewish. So in the Middle Ages, there was a long period of time in which Muslim rulers ruled much of Europe. They ruled Spain, they ruled Turkey, they ruled North Africa. A lot of the Mediterranean was ruled by Muslims. And a good number of Jewish people in diaspora settled in Muslim nations. Of course, Islam and Judaism share a lot of the same traditions, such as the story of Abraham and his son, sacrificing his son. You'll see that this is Islamic representation. This is Islamic art, the same story that Jewish people tell, Christian people tell as well. In the early centuries of the Common Era, little by little, the Jewish people were leaving the area around Palestine. They'd been kicked out of Jerusalem by the Romans. Little by little, they were dispersing away, and a lot moved to Muslim nations. At that time, a lot of Muslim nations were known for their tolerance of other religious traditions, and also for there was a golden age of Muslim empires in which learning and studying was held to be, the highest pursuit. And so a lot of rabbis found places in Muslim courts under Muslim kings, amongst other scholars, places to learn, universities to study at. So there was a time when the Jewish people found places to settle in Muslim countries. Unfortunately, eventually, there were some intolerant Muslim rulers. Some of the Muslim countries, such as Spain, was taken back by the Catholics, and the Catholic rulers of Spain were not very tolerant to the Jews, and so the Jews had to leave those countries and continue on and settle somewhere else. In general, the Jewish people in the Middle Ages, living in Christian countries, became very expendable. They did not adapt 100% to the local cultures. They practiced a different religion. It was a very unusual religion compared to what Christianity was. And starting in 1095, Jews became victims of mobs of Christian crusaders, but not just crusaders. In general, the Jews were very persecuted. There were stories of, I know in England there was a rumor or a superstition that Jewish people, Jewish wanderers, would steal Christian babies and eat them. And so by law, it was lawful for any Christian person to, if they saw a Jewish person like cooking something in a pot, to be able to just walk right up to them and tip the pot over to make sure that there was no baby inside of it. That was an actual thing. The Jewish people were scapegoated for a number of years. You see here, this is a picture of crusaders killing Jewish people, and you can see this is clearly a Christian representation. It's from armor, right? So a knight proudly wore this on his chest, and up here there's an image of an angel, maybe of Jesus or a saint, looking down and blessing this, because to the Crusaders this was God's work, was taking back the Holy Land. Here you see another medieval representation, some Jewish men who are caricatures. You can see from their faces they're caricatures, lending money, because Christians were forbidden at that time by the Catholic Church to ever lend money. And kings and queens always needed to borrow money. Throughout all of history and all of the world, kings and queens always need to borrow money so that they can make armies and they can make castles. And so Jewish people found a niche in Christian countries. They were not allowed into other industries or other businesses, but they were allowed to lend money. And that's where this stereotype of Jewish people as bankers or as money-grubbing comes from. It was the fact that a good number of powerful, rich Christian people were kind of resentful of the fact that these Jewish people whom they looked down upon were making money off of them, lending them money. So despite the fact that there were some Jewish people who were able to make a living through money lending, in general there was increasing deterioration of Jewish life in Western Europe in the 12th through the 17th centuries. Things got pretty bad. You can see here, we looked at this in the first lecture, but again you can see how the Jewish people were expelled from various countries time and time again and had to go and settle somewhere else. And again, this fits into the whole theme of struggle and wandering, right? This is something that's already a part of the Hebrew Scripture, and that's how Jews in the Middle Ages understand the suffering, right? That they, in a way, this is just a continuation, the wandering of the Israelites through the desert, looking for the promised land, living amongst their enemies. You can see here, 1492, 1496, this was a time when the Catholics had retaken Spain, and Jews had to leave there. French were never really too friendly with the Jews long before the Castiles took back Spain. England expelled the Jews in 1290, and slowly they just began moving east. You can see there's a slow move east, and that's why there was a large Jewish population in Poland, in Germany, in Russia at the start of World War II. So amidst all this suffering, how do people react to the suffering? Increasingly in the Middle Ages, there was what the book calls a mystical yearning. There was this desire to encounter God, to have that mystical first-hand encounter with the divine, and gain wisdom from it, and gain understanding, and gain solace and relief from what was a very difficult time in their existence. There were a couple of mystic groups that actually still exist today that came out of the Middle Ages. One was Kabbalah, you may have heard of. Is based on the concept of repairing the world. It is based on this idea that within the Hebrew Scriptures, which were very, very sacred, very holy, that there are esoteric messages, there are secrets within the Hebrew Scriptures. If you understand keywords, if you understand numerology, which is kind of like the magic of numbers and the magic of letters, is this idea that within the whole world there are multiple spiritual levels to things. It's not just physical body and spirit. No, there are like these different spiritual levels. And you could find them and you could learn to understand them through certain esoteric means secret, certain secret esoteric teachings. You might have seen something like this before. This is sometimes called the Kabbalah tree of life. And it is a very complicated diagram of the different spiritual levels of the universe and how they interact. If you look at a more complicated version of the tree of life, you'll see that each of these lines has like a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which represents a power or a force, and basically defines how each spiritual realm interacts with each other spiritual realms. So you have to understand what these spiritual realms are. You have to understand the forces that bind them together and make them interact. And by doing so, you can gain a greater understanding of God. So Kabbalah is very much a book-oriented, a learning-oriented movement, right? It's based in secret groups of rabbis who get together and share these secrets and look carefully at the Torah for secret meanings and things. But that's not really practical for all people, right? Not everyone can even read, much less not everyone is interested in finding God through study. So another mystical group that came out of Kabbalah was a Hasidism. Hasidic Jews were looking for the same levels of mystic experience that Kabbalah was, but they were looking for it more immediately, and they were looking for it more universally for all people, and through practice. The Hasidic Jews were famous in the Ukraine and in Poland about the 16th, 17th century for this ecstatic, joyful worship. Playing music and dancing and singing and ecstatic, joyful experiences, not being crowded over a book looking for little secrets to the universe, but rather experiencing God and feeling the joy of experiencing God, right? So two very different forms of mysticism coming from the same time. Hasidism also has an important tradition of tzaddiks, who are enlightened, like saint teacher people, like very well-revered rabbis who teach these sorts of practices. And as I say, it began in Ukraine and Poland, became very large in Russia as well, and to this day, Hasidic Jews still exist. They exist in America. They mostly come from Eastern Europe, where they originally came from, but also there are quite a few Hasidic Jews in Israel as well, as you can imagine. So these two mystic movements began in the Middle Ages, but they carry over all the way up until present time, right? This is how they deal with the struggle of being constantly expelled and persecuted, and seeking mystic relief, so to speak. So, Judaism and modernity. The question came about by the 18th century. Do we secularize or do we not secularize? This was the same question the Christians were asking themselves. In the 18th century, a new intellectual movement came about called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement of rational thought and scientific study. The Enlightenment believed that everything in the world could be understood through rational thought and through scientific study, and that if science disagreed with what was in religion, it was because religion was based in superstition, right? So that slow divide between science and religion really didn't exist until the Enlightenment. Up until the Enlightenment, it was understood that science was a study of God's world, right? In Western Europe, if you're studying the world, that means you're trying to study God's creation, right? The Enlightenment came about and said, no, science can teach us things that God can't, and these are two kind of separate things. And that's where we get kind of this idea of like there being a secular world and there being a religious world. This is really, really important because up to this point in history, everything was religious. Religion pervaded all parts of life, right? Just as we've seen in Asia. But that idea of that science can say more than religion can, or that not necessarily science, but rational thought. Rational thought can explain more than religion and superstition and magic and things like that. It really created a new worldview for Western Europe that carried over into America and carries it on up to today. So Enlightenment Jews were Jewish people who felt that they should try to secularize their traditions more and adapt more to the cultures that they were living in. Right? Instead of living separate from the other Christians in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, because they weren't accepted, the Jewish people weren't accepted into Christian communities, they had to live separately. Some rabbis and thinkers thought maybe we should secularize our lives. We can practice our religion, but we can live in secular society, right, and become part of society, not have to live on the outskirts. So during this time, two movements came about within Judaism: Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism. Orthodox Judaism greatly resisted secularization. The quote from the book is from a famous Orthodox leader. It says, "We have an old father, praised be his name, who has never changed and will never change." So what that means is our father has not changed, so we're not going to change. Because ultimately we're not interested in things of this world, we're interested in God, so we're not going to change to suit the world's desires. As Reform Judaism developed, Reform Judaism really altered the kind of practices that Jews would follow in synagogues. They began developing these sorts of Sunday services instead of going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, which is Friday to Saturday for the Jewish people, Sunset Friday to Sunset Saturday. That is the holy day for the Jewish people. That's when they go to the synagogue. That's when they pray together as a group. They switched their ceremonies only over to Sunday, and they developed hymns. Rabbis started giving sermons, which they never really did before. I mean, normally in synagogues you would read from the Torah, and there might be some songs, there might be a lot of praying, but there wouldn't be sermons. That's a kind of a Christian thing. So Reform Judaism developed these very kind of pseudo-Christian practices to make them blend in more. And the idea was we can fit with the rest of society. We don't have to give up who we are just because we practice on Sunday. So we're giving up who we are. We're just trying to integrate better so that we can have better lives for ourselves, better lives for our families, and not stick out like sore thumbs like we always have. So this is ultimately the great debate between absolutism and liberalism. If you remember, many months ago on the first week of class, we talked about absolutism and liberalism, and this is ultimately the argument. It's like, do you stick to your traditions and do you be faithful to your traditions, or do you try and fit into the world around you, remaining faithful in your heart, right? So this led to the three modern sects of Judaism: Orthodox Judaism, Reform Judaism, and Conservative Judaism. These are Orthodox Jews. You can tell they've stayed faithful to the traditional way of dressing and performing ceremonies. This is Reform Judaism. These are 4 or 5 female rabbis, because Reform Judaism now accepts women to be rabbis, and you can tell that it's much more. It's very different from Orthodox Judaism. It's much more, I guess, adapted to kind of Western Christian cultures. In the middle, this is actually from, interestingly enough, this is actually from a South American synagogue, and I'm not sure which country it's from. It might be Mexico, but this is a conservative Jewish community. Conservative Judaism falls in the middle. Orthodox Judaism took one extreme, Reform Judaism kind of went to another extreme. Conservative Judaism kind of tries to take that middle path, right? Adapting, but not adapting too much. And next week we're going to have a guest lecturer who is a conservative Jew. I'm not sure if he's going to talk about what his sect means to him, but conservative Judaism is actually the largest of the three sects. For that reason, it's kind of the middle of the road sect. Okay. So that was the development of those sects happened in the 18th and 19th century. So a lot of Jews were able to kind of integrate more into society, but that doesn't mean that they were fully accepted. By the 20th century, the Jewish people were still not completely accepted into Christian society, and for that matter, Jewish people weren't necessarily looking to be completely accepted. It's always been the case that Jewish people only marry Jewish people, and that traditionally, if a Jewish person marries outside of their religion, if they marry a Christian, they would be outed from their family. They'd be kicked out and never spoken to again. And that says nothing for if you converted. That was just, for the Jewish people, it was literally sacrilege. You were turning your back on your religion, but you were also turning your back on your family, right? You have to be loyal to your family or tradition. So even though there was a process of secularization amongst the Jewish people, that doesn't mean that they completely adapted and were completely accepted or completely accepted their situations, right? After World War I in the 1920s, Europe got hit really, really badly with an economic tradition. The 1920s, when America's economy was booming, Germany's economy was just in the gutters. I had a history teacher who said that World War II was caused by the end of World War I. What that means is that in World War I in 1917, the Germans lost, and the treaty that ended that war put really great economic pressure and penalties on the Germans for starting the war, for having seemingly started World War I. When they lost, they had to pay through the nose, quite literally, and their economy just was in the gutters. So even before the Great Depression, Germany's economy was in a depression. The Nazi Party came along, and it was based on the concept of nationalism, which was something that was taking a lot of Europe by storm. It was this idea that we are a nation, we are a country, but our nationality is also wrapped up in our ethnicity, what ethnicity we are, and that our bloodline is different than other bloodlines, and that makes us better than other people. That's what nationalism is. And Germany is certainly not the only nation guilty of nationalism. It exists all over the world, even until today. The Nazi Party was based on nationalism, and in a time when the German people were suffering and they were angry, and especially in the 1920s when the rest of the world was in an economic boom, they were looking for someone to blame. And the Nazi Party turned the blame on the Jewish people, which was very easy to do because there were a number of Jewish bankers who had been lending money for many centuries because that was the only job that they could get. But now that the economy was in the gutter, it was easy to blame them because they were outsiders, and it seemed like they were in control of the money, like they had some control over the economic situation. Under Nazi Germany and under Adolf Hitler, when he eventually became the leader of Germany, a number of laws were passed to separate Jewish people from the rest of the population. So this is very much a continuation of what the Jewish people had experienced for 2,000 years, right? And if you study Jewish reactions to the early anti-Semitic laws in Germany, a lot of Jewish people were like, we've done this before, we've been there, we've done that. A lot of them were not aware of the extremes that the Nazi Party would eventually go to. But Jewish people were expected to live separately from the rest of the population. They were deprived of legal rights, of economic rights. This is a picture here from the 1930s, a sign put up in a store window that says Jewish people are not allowed, very much the way in the American South, under Jim Crow laws, black people couldn't use the same water fountains are the same bathrooms as white people. It's very much what was happening in Germany at the time. Jewish people were slowly being separated, and eventually Nazi soldiers were going into Jewish homes and kicking them out and putting them together into these ghettos, into these walled blocks, neighborhood blocks, where they had to live in very crowded, poor conditions. They couldn't leave, they couldn't work, they received very little food, and eventually, by 1942, the Nazi Party was taking people from the ghettos, putting them on trains, and sending them to concentration camps. So the situation in Germany escalated in an alarmingly fast rate, from laws of persecution to outright mass murder in about 10 years. Here you can see this Jewish family is living in a ghetto, and by that point, all Jews were expected to sew the Star of David onto all their clothes so that people could see them and know that they were Jewish, right? This was like a way of warning the good Christian German people, don't go near this person, they're Jewish. So it was really quite inhuman. But this is what happens when people are poor and they're starving and they're desperate and they want to blame something. This is what humanity does. We can't blame the Germans. It's something that unfortunately all human beings are capable of. Of course, the Holocaust, in the concentration camps, the Jewish people were being slowly starved to death. And it wasn't just Jewish people. There were other small minority groups that were sent to the concentration camps as well. Anyone who was outed as a homosexual, anyone who basically wasn't Christian. A lot of Catholics in Germany suffered as well. The Gypsies were also a nomadic group, and a lot of people associated with the Jewish people, even though they were something completely separate from the Jewish people, were also sent to concentration camps. And they were slowly starved and worked to death, and if a concentration camp had just too many people, they were sent to gas chambers. You can see here there are children in a concentration camp who are showing their tattoos. Everyone in concentration camp got a tattoo, a number. That was their identification. Even till today, Holocaust survivors can show you the tattoo numbers that they had on their arms. So it was a horrendous thing, and it was, in so many ways, the culmination of just millennia of persecution and wandering and struggle that the Jewish people went through. And it has defined modern history for modern Jewish people. You can't talk about modern Judaism without somehow coming back to the Holocaust. Every Jewish friend that I've ever had has had at least one family member who died in the Holocaust. And it also led to a great influx of Jewish people into America, right? A lot of people trying to escape that. So in the end, there were 6 million European Jews who died in the Holocaust. That's a third of the Jewish people in the world at the time. So as I say, it's not hard to imagine that every Jewish person that I know knows someone who died in the Holocaust, or has a family member who died in the Holocaust. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, etc. So after the Holocaust and after the rest of the world was shown the horrors that had happened in the concentration camps, because one of the things about the 20th century that you can't forget is that by the 20th century, communications had increased to the place where you could take pictures of things that were happening on one side of the world and disseminate them on the other side of the world, and you could send information that quickly. This happened and the whole world knew about it. Everyone had TVs by the 1960s in the United States, and they were already making movies and documentaries about the Holocaust. So the knowledge of the horrors and the insanity that happened there spread very quickly, and it was decided that something needed to be done about Jewish persecution. So perhaps meaning well, the United Nations got together and they came up with an idea. Zionism had been a movement since the late 19th century. Zionism was not a new thing. The movement to go back to Israel and make a small Israeli state for the Jewish people. This had been kind of a dream of a lot of people for a long time. And after World War II, the UN fast-tracked it and decided to partition part of Palestine which was a Muslim country, it was an established country, into two areas, one to be governed by Jewish people, one to be governed by Arabs. And they made Jerusalem an international zone because they recognized that Jerusalem was a holy city, both to the Jewish people and to Muslims both, right? So they didn't want to give Jerusalem to one side or another, so they said it'll belong to both. The Arabs did not accept the partition. This was a tactical error. And that is how the modern state of Israel came to be. So what can I say about this? If you follow the news at all, you'll know that the situation in Israel is just politically just insane. It's been constant warfare for 40 years. It's been, terrorism and soldiers and fighting and a lot of political, a lot of politics. A lot of political powers from all over the world getting involved, America getting involved with it, China's getting involved, Russia gets involved with it, all the Middle Eastern countries are involved with it. Everyone has a horse in this race as to how power should be in Israel and how much land either group is entitled to. That's the big question in Israel and Palestine, is which territory belongs to who. Because initially it wasn't well handled. And there were a lot of disagreements, and there were a lot of treaties upon treaties to deal with the disagreements, and today you'll find that there are a lot of different opinions about what land belongs to whom. If you go back to the very, very beginning, you see this boat here, and all these people, they're so happy. They're going to a Jewish state. After 2,000 years, they have a Jewish state. And I have a good friend whose father is Jewish. He doesn't consider himself Jewish. My friend was born and raised in England, and his name is Ben. And I didn't know this, but his dad is actually kind of older, and his dad was one of the original Jewish settlers in Israel. And his father, the way his father tells the story, is that when the first Jewish settlers got there, they were happy to live in peace with the Palestinians. There weren't that many settlers, and a lot of them had they were forming farms, and they were, they weren't trying to stir up trouble, so to speak, and that in the beginning the Arab people and the Jewish people lived together pretty peacefully. And then he said, according the way his father tells the story, and keep in mind this is a biased kind of story, this is from his point of view, the leaders of Israel came in and said, no, we should have this land as well, and we need to go to war for it. And so they did, and they took more land, and that led to more fighting, which ended up leading to taking more land, and then you had an influx of Jewish people from Soviet Union who were escaping the Soviet Union. You'll remember the 1950s. Russia became communist, and a good number of Christians and Jews were trying to escape persecution in Russia. There were a lot of Russian Jews, Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Jews who went down to Israel, and they felt like this was God's hand. This was, the return of Israel to glory. And a lot of extremists came around in that time and said, no, all of this land belongs to us. This is scripture, this is prophecy, this is us returning to the Holy Land, and this is our land. And things just got increasingly complicated. Just more and more voices who had more and more ideas about what needed to be done. And eventually my friend's father ended up leaving Israel and emigrating to England. And he just had enough of it. He just had enough of it. In his youth, he was very idealistic, and he was very peaceful. And he went to several wars that he didn't want to go to, and he saw things get very violent, and he didn't understand why. And my friend Ben will say to me, my father and all of my father's generation that I've met, the first settlers of Israel, are pacifists now. They are completely 100% against war because they've seen what it did. They've seen what it did to the Holy Land. So that, in a nutshell, I'm not getting into the political details of the treaties and the wars because that would be like a whole other class. That'd be another course. You could spend an entire semester talking about that. But in a very, very, very small nutshell, That is what has led to the political unrest in contemporary Israel. So again, 1948, Israel was declared an independent Jewish state. As at that time, Britain had still been occupying a lot of Palestine in the Middle East. But after World War II, a lot of the European nations started breaking down their great empires. Britain, in particular, had the largest empire. It had, the Middle East. It had Hong Kong. It had India. It had parts. It had Canada. It had islands around South America. And after World War II, Britain started releasing these colonies. As soon as Britain, and that's why it made sense at the time to give this land to the Jewish people, because it was still under control of the British. The problem was the Arab people wanted the British out, and they didn't think the British had any right to give this land to the Israeli people. So as soon as they left, Israel started getting attacked by its neighbors, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. And they've tried to make peace time and time again, but again, there are just too many voices. There are too many voices in this argument, and there are too many players, and it's impossible to make peace when it's not just, when it's so complicated. To that end, I gathered up a few pictures. I want to give you an idea again of how complicated this gets. So these are Palestinian, or they might not be Palestinian, they're Arab though. These are Arab protesters that say, Israel, your days are numbered. For world peace, Israel must be destroyed. So they're very clearly anti-Israeli state. Now look just below this, you see Orthodox Jews who are also protesting Israel, saying Zionism and Judaism are diametrically opposed. Zionism is the cause of Mideast bloodshed. So in recent years, there has been a strong movement amongst a number of Jewish people to draw a line between Judaism and Zionism. Zionism being the movement to create and protect the Israeli state and to expand the Israeli state. That's what really has caused a lot of wars, is that Israel is trying to expand and eat up more of Palestine. Right? So a number of Jews have come out and said, no, we're Jewish, but we are not Zionists. So two groups that are diametrically opposed but are kind of for the same thing in some ways, right? They're anti-expansion of the Jewish state. Now, go to the other side of this slide, we see in America, the one with the sign that says Christians love Israel, right? So in the West, a lot of people support Israel because it's an ally to the United States. It's an ally to Western European countries in a region where we don't have many allies, right? Iraq isn't exactly an ally. Iran isn't an ally. A lot of other nations in and around that area are in this gray area, politically speaking, right? This is when Israel and Zionism goes from being a religious issue to a political issue. A lot of people want to have a Jewish state in the Middle East that is friendly to the United States and to England and to Europe and to Canada and all those places, right? So there is a strong movement within the United States to support Israel. Then, here you see some Israeli students, right? And this is within Israel. It says Israel is on the map to stay. Israel is on the map to stay. So these people were born and raised in Israel. It should be noted that Israel is like a very westernized, modernized country. You can tell from the way they dress. These are very like modern, secular Jewish kids, and they're fighting out of a sense of pride in their nation, right? They don't want to be taken off the map. So there are several issues going on here. There's political, international issues. There's a question of whether or not, we want to keep Israel, but does that mean expanding it? These people would probably say no. These people would say that Israel just needs to go altogether. So there's this great sliding scale of opinion, and there's this all of these different all of these different factors that factor into this issue. And that, in a nutshell, is why the issue of Israel and Palestine is so very, very complicated in politics, and why it dominates the news cycle. So there's always something going on there. And I honestly don't know what it's going to take for that region to find peace. But with so many voices yelling all at the same time, it's going to be really difficult to get all of the players to agree on one course of action.